At the private terminal of Alderbrook International Airport, Evelyn Harrington Cross walked toward the jet that would carry her to the largest deal of her life. Beside her strode the billionaire Pierce Blackwell, and beyond the glass the engines of a waiting aircraft hummed low across the runway. Then a night shift worker named Miles Callahan stepped forward and pressed a folded slip of paper into her hand. She almost called security until she read the words inside. Your mother did not leave you at gate B12. She left the truth in locker 314. That single note bent the whole direction of her life. If you love family secrets that shatter with nothing more than one small slip of paper, tap subscribe now and stay with this story until the very last minute. The private terminal at Alderbrook International Airport was built for people who never waited in ordinary lines. Its floors were polished stone, its lounges wrapped in soft light, and its windows framed the runway like paintings meant only for the wealthy. On that gray morning, Evelyn Harrington Cross moved through it, the way a queen moves through a palace she owns, in a white tailored suit, her assistant a half-step behind, her lawyer at her shoulder, and the man the papers called her future husband walking easily at her side. She was 35 years old, chief executive of Harrington Cross Global, and she carried herself as though nothing in the world had ever been allowed to touch her without permission. She was flying to New York aboard her family's private jet to sign a merger between Harrington Cross Global and Blackwell Sovereign Capital. On paper, the arrangement would lift her to the summit of the industry, uniting private aviation, airport hotels, and infrastructure real estate under one enormous banner. What the papers did not say, and what she barely let herself think, was that the same signature would hand Pierce Blackwell control over a great many of her family's airport assets. She had convinced herself this was strength. Strength was the only thing she trusted. Miles Callahan was not supposed to be anywhere near that terminal. He managed the night shift in lost baggage and operational records, a quiet man of 39 in a worn staff jacket, and the moment he tried to approach the private gate, 2 guards moved to block him. He did not look like a man permitted to stand near a chief executive. He looked exactly like what he was, a single father who worked while the rest of the city slept, someone the powerful were trained not to see. He did not raise his voice. He simply told Evelyn that she should not sign anything before she read one slip of paper. She looked at him the way one looks at a stain on an expensive coat, and asked what a poor airport employee could possibly know about a deal worth more than he would earn in 100 lifetimes. Pierce Blackwell laughed softly and called Miles a man who had wandered somewhere he did not belong. Evelyn turned to walk on. Then Miles said 2 words that stopped her feet. Gate B12. It was the place where, more than 20 years earlier, her mother was said to have abandoned her. No one outside the family spoke that name. No one was supposed to know it existed. She turned back slowly, and the color of the morning seemed to change. He handed her the note. The paper was old, yellowed at the folds, soft as cloth from age. Across it, in careful ink, were the words that would not leave her mind for the rest of her life. Your mother did not leave you at gate B12. She left the truth in locker 314. For a moment Evelyn only stared, and then anger rose in her like heat, because she was certain this stranger was digging into an old wound to make himself important. She called for security. As the guards took his arms, Miles spoke once more, calmly, almost gently. He told her that if she boarded that plane today, she would sign away the last thing her mother had ever tried to keep for her. Then he was walked backward through the polished terminal, and Evelyn told herself he was nothing, a desperate man chasing a rich woman's grief. She boarded the jet. She fastened her seat, accepted a glass of water she did not drink, and let the engines build beneath her. But as the aircraft began to roll, some restless instinct made her unfold the note one last time, and there, below the first lines, in smaller letters she had not seen, were 2 words that stopped her breath. Little Sparrow. It was the name her mother had called her, and no one alive was supposed to remember it. The story of the note truly began not in that gleaming terminal, but in a small house near the edge of the airfield, where Miles Callahan lived with his 9-year-old daughter. He worked nights so that his days could belong to her, so that he could make breakfast and walk her to the corner and be awake for the small emergencies that make up a child's world. That evening, before his shift, his phone had lit with her voice, asking whether he had eaten dinner yet. He told her he had, though it was not true, and he did not tell her that he had just placed himself in the path of one of the most powerful families in the country. Miles was not a man who went looking for trouble in the lives of the rich. He kept to himself. His work was among the forgotten things, the suitcases no one claimed, the old passports, the handwritten letters, the boxes of documents that had outlived the names on their labels. He had one rule that he had never spoken aloud but had never broken. A thing being lost did not mean the truth inside it was allowed to disappear. A few weeks earlier, the airport had begun tearing down part of the old Terminal B to build a new lounge for private travelers. In the slow work of moving an aging bank of storage lockers, Miles had found one that did not fit. Locker 314 was sealed under a code that matched nothing. It was not on the public inventory of airport property, and it did not appear in any ordinary record of lost belongings, as though someone long ago had wanted it to exist without being seen. Inside he had found an old leather bag, a silk scarf, a handful of photographs, a small recording, a folder of ownership documents, and a bundle of letters that had never been mailed. Every item circled back to one name, Lillian Vale. When he read that name, he did not yet know she was the mother of the woman who ran Harrington Cross Global. He only knew that something about the way the locker had been sealed made the hair rise on his arms. He had learned across 2 decades of nights that objects keep their own kind of honesty. A suitcase carries the weight of where it was going. A ticket remembers a departure that may or may not have happened. And a locker sealed against its own inventory, hidden from the lists that governed every other cabinet in the terminal, was a thing that had been made to lie by staying shut. Miles handled each item the way a careful man handles evidence he does not yet understand, aware that whatever he touched might one day have to speak for someone who could no longer speak for herself. He had meant to hand it all to airport management, as the rules required. But when he studied the sealing record, he found something that did not belong in the ordinary world of lost property. More than 20 years before, the legal office of Harrington Cross Global had filed a private instruction that this single locker was never to be opened. A company did not reach across 2 decades to lock away a scarf and a few photographs unless those ordinary things guarded something extraordinary. That was the moment his simple discovery became a question he could not put down. If Lillian Vale had truly walked out on her family, if she had truly taken money and vanished, then why would that same family spend its lawyers and its silence to keep her locker buried inside an airport? The lie and the lock did not agree with each other, and Miles had spent his whole working life learning to notice when 2 records refused to tell the same story. Alone in the fluorescent quiet, he had played the small recording. A woman's voice rose from it, trembling but clear, speaking to a future she could not see. "If my daughter ever comes back to this airport," the voice said, "please tell her that I did not leave because of money." Miles had sat very still for a long time after that, a single father listening to another parent's grief, understanding at last that he was holding something he could not simply file away and forget. High above the country, inside the private jet, Evelyn could not make the merger documents hold still in her mind. The letters swam. The note had cracked something open, and behind the crack was the one memory the Harrington Cross family had forbidden anyone to touch. Gate B12 was not a place to her. It was the wound at the center of who she had become. When she was small, her father, Conrad Harrington Cross, had sat her down and told her the story that would shape every year that followed. Her mother, Lillian Vale, had abandoned them at this very airport to run away with another man and a great deal of money. He told it plainly, without tears, the way one delivers a verdict. From that day forward, Evelyn grew up believing that love was the soft place where betrayal entered, and that power was the only wall that could keep a person from being left behind. Conrad did not let the story stay a wound. He sharpened it into a lesson. A Harrington cross, he taught her, does not weep for the ones who walk away. She learned to be cold because coldness had been offered to her as armor. She learned to put the family name before her own heart, and she was praised each time she did, until the praise and the loneliness became the same feeling. So she had grown into a flawless and solitary chief executive, admired and unreachable. And when Pierce Blackwell entered her life, she had not chosen him the way a woman chooses a beloved. She had chosen him the way a fortress chooses a wall. He represented everything she had been taught, was safe, money that answered to money, power that recognized power, a man who would never need her enough to hurt her. It was, she had told herself, a sensible arrangement between equals. Pierce noticed her distraction now, the way a careful investor notices a number that has slipped. He leaned close and told her gently to throw the paper away. People who worked in airports, he said, learned to sniff out grief in the famous and to spin small tragedies into paydays. His voice was smooth and reasonable, and beneath the courtesy lay a contempt so complete that it did not even bother to hide. She almost tore the note in half. Her fingers were already at the fold. But the two words held her hand still. Little sparrow. When she was a girl, her mother had stitched the shape of a small sparrow onto the collar of her coat, a private thing, a secret between them, and not one soul at the company had ever known it. A con artist could invent a story about a gate. A con artist could not have known about the bird. She lowered the paper and asked the pilot to hold the takeoff. Pierce's smooth expression tightened at the edges. She told him, evenly, that she needed to verify one thing before she signed anything at all, and that the deal that had waited months could wait one afternoon more. He did not argue in front of the crew, but she felt the temperature between them fall. The jet returned to the gate. As she stepped down onto the tarmac, the wind pulling at her white suit, her phone rang, and her father's name glowed on the screen. His voice, when she answered, was colder than she had ever heard it, and utterly without warmth or worry. "You met the man at that airport," he said. It was not a question, and in the flat certainty of those words, Evelyn understood that her father already knew what she had barely begun to suspect. She walked back into the private lounge and summoned Camille Rhodes, the lawyer who had stood at her shoulder all morning. She told her to pull every record connected to Gate B12, to Locker 314, and to Lillian Vale. Camille was a careful and rational woman, and at first she treated the request as a private grief with no bearing on the merger. But Evelyn told her plainly that if the note spoke the truth, it might reach all the way into the ownership of Harrington Cross Global itself. Conrad arrived at the airport far faster than a man his age and station should have managed, as though he had already been near, already braced. He did not ask his daughter whether she was well. He asked, at once and above all, what exactly Miles Callahan had said to her, and whether she had accepted anything from his hands. A father who loved her would have asked after her heart. This father asked only after the evidence, and the difference told Evelyn more than any document could. He tried to fold her back into the old story. Miles was a fortune hunter, he said, the kind of man who smells money and invents pain to reach it. Her mother had truly left them. The poor always knew how to feed on the sorrow of the rich, and if Evelyn wrecked the schedule now, Pierce might walk away from the merger, the board would lose its nerve, and everything the family had built would tremble. He spoke of loyalty, but every sentence was a lever. Evelyn looked at her father and asked one plain question. What is in Locker 314? Conrad was silent a moment too long, a silence with a shape to it, and then he said it was only an old cabinet of her mother's belongings, worthless, forgotten, not worth the fuel it would take to think about. But Evelyn had watched men across enough negotiating tables to know the difference between a man who does not care and a man who is very carefully pretending not to. While father and daughter circled each other in the lounge, Miles was suspended by airport security for approaching a private traveler outside of protocol. He did not fight it. He asked only one thing of the officers, that they preserve the locker and its contents, and that they not allow the offices of Harrington Cross Global to remove it before Evelyn herself had seen what was inside. Even as they took his badge, he was thinking not of himself, but of the chain that kept the truth intact. Camille went to meet him quietly, half expecting a swindler, and found instead a tired man who wanted nothing for himself. He gave her a copy of the sealing record, a copy of Lillian's recording, and an old list of departures from the week her mother was said to have fled. On that list of flights leaving Alderbrook, in the days that mattered, Lillian Vale's name did not appear. She had never boarded the plane that Conrad had described for more than 20 years. Camille called Evelyn from a stairwell, her lawyer's caution gone thin. "If these records are real," she said slowly, "then your mother never left this airport on the flight your father has been describing your whole life." For a long moment there was only the sound of the terminal on the line, the distant chime of a boarding call, and Evelyn standing very still in a white suit at the center of a story that had just begun to come apart. Evelyn decided to go down to the old Terminal B herself. It was the one place in the airport she had spent her life avoiding because it was bound in her mind to the mother who had walked away. Now she walked its corridors with her heels echoing past faded signs and yellowed light, past the far, hollow sound of an announcement meant for gates that no longer ran, past doors already marked for demolition. The whole wing felt like a held breath, like a place waiting to be told what it had really witnessed. Miles was brought in to open the locker, because he was the one who had found the false seal, and he alone knew how it had been set. At first Evelyn kept her distance and told him plainly that she did not trust him. He answered without offense that she did not need to trust him at all. She only needed to trust what her mother had left behind, and to let the objects speak for themselves. Locker 314 was opened in the presence of Evelyn, Camille, and a representative of the airport. There was no cash inside. There were no jewels. There were only the small, ordinary relics of a life, a silk scarf soft with age, an airline ticket that had never been used, a tiny silver sparrow, and a folder wrapped carefully against the damp. The plainness of it was somehow more devastating than treasure would have been. Evelyn's hand trembled when she lifted the silver bird. It was the emblem her mother had woven into every small gift of her childhood, the private sign of a love she had been taught to believe had never existed. Conrad had told her, again and again, that Lillian left nothing behind because Lillian had cared for nothing. The contents of that locker called her father a liar without saying a single word. The most important thing in the folder was an amendment to an ownership agreement, and across the top of it was a name Evelyn had never heard. The Vale Aviation Trust. The document set out, in the dry language of law, that Lillian Vale had not been merely the wife of Conrad Harrington Cross. She had been a joint owner of a share in the very airport land and development rights that Harrington Cross Global was, at this exact moment, preparing to sign over to Blackwell in the merger. If the amendment still held force, then Evelyn had the legal power to stop the deal outright. And if it had been hidden, then Conrad had deceived not only his daughter, but the board and the shareholders for more than 20 years. The scarf and the sparrow had told her that her mother loved her. The folder told her that her father had built an empire on a locked door. Lillian's recording, when they listened further, filled in the rest. She had discovered that Conrad intended to strip assets out of the Vale Aviation Trust to pledge against private loans of his own. She had gathered proof and meant to bring it to a lawyer, here, at this airport, on the day everything ended. She had come to Gate B12 not to abandon her daughter, but to defend her, and then she had vanished from Evelyn's life, forced into a silence whose shape they were only beginning to trace. At the bottom of the folder, Evelyn found a letter written to her alone, in her mother's hand. The first line undid 20 years in a single breath. "Little Sparrow," it read, "if you are reading this, it means that at last someone refused to let them bury me inside a lie." Evelyn did not sob. She simply held the page while the old terminal went quiet around her and felt the ground of her entire life shift beneath her feet. With her mother's letter still folded in her hand, Evelyn began, for the first time, to look hard at the deal itself. On its surface, Blackwell's sovereign capital was rescuing Harrington Cross Global with an investment so large it silenced doubt. But when she traced the structure with Camille, she saw what the size of the number had been designed to hide. The arrangement handed Pierce control over the assets ringing Alderbrook, the hotels, the private jet aprons, and the development rights to the very Terminal B where she now stood. Camille found the sharpest thread. Over the past year, Blackwell had quietly bought up the debt of several small companies beneath the Harrington Cross umbrella. If Evelyn signed, Pierce would not merely become a partner. He would hold his hand at the throat of the entire airport division, able to squeeze whenever it suited him, a rescuer who had first arranged the drowning. Worse still, there was reason to believe that Pierce already knew about the Vail Aviation Trust. Buried in the draft of the merger was a small, colorless clause that required Evelyn to surrender all past claims connected to the ownership of airport property. Read alone, it meant nothing. Read beside her mother's folder, it was a trap, precisely shaped to erase Lillian's evidence forever, the instant Evelyn's pen touched the page. She confronted Pierce in the private lounge, the tiny silver sparrow closed in her fist. He did not fully deny it. He told her with the patience of a man explaining weather to a child that every great family carried stains in its history, and that the work of an intelligent chief executive was to close such things quietly, not to open them in front of cameras. He spoke of scandal the way her father had spoken of loyalty, as a leash dressed up as care. He advised her to sign, and afterward, he promised he would help her deal with Conrad and with Lillian's records discreetly, out of sight. In other words, he did not love her enough to protect the truth. He wanted to purchase her whole life with one clean contract, to fold her mother's proof and her father's crime into a single sealed transaction that would belong to him. The rescue and the theft, she finally understood, were the same act wearing two faces. Miles stood outside the edge of that conversation and did not push his way into it. He offered no speeches and asked for nothing. Yet as Evelyn looked from the billionaire to the night shift worker, she saw the difference between them written in the silence. Pierce wanted to own her decision. Miles was content to let her make it. One man had spent the morning trying to buy her, and the other had simply handed her the truth and stepped back. Pierce, sensing the ground moving, dropped the last of his warmth. He warned her that if she chose to believe an airport employee over a billionaire who was saving her company, she would lose everything at once: the deal, the confidence of the board, and the family name she had bled for her whole life. It was meant to sound like protection. It landed like a threat, and Evelyn had heard that particular threat before in her father's voice, across a childhood of learning to be afraid. Conrad did not wait to be beaten. He began to strike back with the full weight of the family behind him. He leaned on his relationships at the airport and demanded that Miles be dismissed for violating the security of a private traveler. At the same time, unnamed sources began to whisper to the financial press that a single father on the night shift was trying to extort a grieving chief executive with an invented tale about her mother. Miles was pushed into an impossible corner. He had no team of lawyers, no friends in the press, no money to fight a dynasty that could spend more on a single dinner than he earned in a year. A few of his co-workers, who had nodded to him for a decade in the corridors, began to keep their distance, afraid of the shadow that now followed him. The scene sharpened every ounce of contempt the powerful could muster. They called him a parasite feeding on tragedy, a small man reaching for a payday inside another person's pain. Conrad went further still and offered him a great sum of money, on one condition, that Miles sign a paper admitting he had misunderstood the contents of the locker, that the whole thing had been an honest mistake by a confused employee. Miles refused. He said the things in the locker had never belonged to him, and so he had no right to sell their silence. Conrad's voice went cold and precise, and he mentioned Miles's daughter, and suggested that a single father, above all men, ought to know how to choose safety for the small family that depended on him. It was the oldest weapon the powerful owned, and Conrad wielded it without a flicker of shame. Miles did not lose his calm. He answered quietly that he chose safety every single night in that airport, in the careful, unglamorous work of keeping things where they belonged. But safety, he said, did not mean letting rich men lock the truth inside a cabinet and then call the silence peace. He would not trade his daughter's father for a lie, because the man she deserved was the one who did not sign. Evelyn heard part of that exchange, relayed to her by Camille, and something in her went very still. For the first time she recognized the sound of it. Conrad was using on Miles the exact instrument he had used on her all her life. Control dressed as concern, fear offered as love. She had spent 35 years mistaking that voice for wisdom, and now she heard it plainly for what it was. Miles was formally suspended before the day was out, but before he walked out of the terminal, he pressed a small drive into Camille's hand. It held a copy of old footage, pulled from the airport's archived cameras, recorded on the day Lillian Vale disappeared from the world. He had saved it not as a weapon and not as leverage, but because a man who guarded lost things could not bring himself to let this one be lost too. Camille recovered the footage from the drive that night. The images were grainy and dim, softened by 20 years of storage, but they were clear enough to tear a family story in half. Lillian Vale had not boarded any plane to run away. She appeared at gate B12 carrying a bag of documents, glancing at the corridor, waiting for someone, plainly there to meet a lawyer. Then Conrad arrived, and the two of them argued, their movements sharp even through the failing image, and afterward, Lillian was guided away toward the private offices Harrington Cross kept inside the airport. There was no violence in the footage. That was almost the worst of it. There was only control, only pressure, only doors closing one after another, only a woman walking out of the public record on the strength of paperwork rather than force. The cruelty had worn a suit and carried a pen, and it had made a mother vanish without ever once raising a hand. Camille traced the silence to its source, a settlement that Lillian had been forced to sign. Under its terms, Lillian was made to leave Evelyn's life entirely, and in exchange Conrad agreed not to destroy the reputation of the Vale family and not to freeze the medical fund that was keeping Lillian's own mother alive. It was manipulation carved into law, a threat aimed at a dying grandmother, and it had needed no bruises at all to be monstrous. Evelyn watched the footage in an old operations room deep in the airport, the same building she had spent a lifetime avoiding. She did not cry out. She sat in perfect silence, as though the foundation of her whole existence had quietly given way beneath the chair. The mother she had hated for more than 20 years had never abandoned her. The father she had trusted, obeyed, and tried so hard to please was the architect of the wound. At that exact moment, as if summoned by the collapse, Conrad walked in, flanked by Pierce and his personal lawyer. He moved at once to seize control of the room. The footage, he insisted, held no legal weight, and if Evelyn were reckless enough to make it public, the company would fall into crisis, the shareholders would flee, and everything her grandparents had built would burn. Pierce offered the smooth alternative he had prepared all along. Erase the trail, sign the merger, and afterward, quietly, they would ease Conrad out of his honorary seat. Evelyn could keep the company and avoid the scandal in a single clean stroke. Let the past stay lost, he said, and keep the future they had agreed upon. It was the largest temptation of her life, wrapped in reason and offered by two smiling men. But Evelyn looked down at the note still folded in her hand, at the words "Your mother did not leave you," written in the careful ink of a stranger. A night shift worker she had never met, a man with nothing to gain and everything to lose, had dared to hand her the truth, while her own father and the man she had meant to marry stood shoulder to shoulder begging her to bury it. In that contrast, she finally saw clearly which men had loved the family name and which had loved her not at all. She lifted her eyes to Conrad and to Pierce and told them she would not sign, and she would not hide. Then she made her decision real. She called an emergency meeting, to be held in the old Terminal B itself, before the demolition crews arrived, and she summoned the board of directors, the airport's representatives, her lawyers, and the financial press to the very place where the truth had been sealed away. Old Terminal B became the stage for everything to break open. The wing that had been built to bury a secret now filled with people, the Harrington Cross Board in their dark suits, the representatives of Blackwell, the financial press with their recorders, airport staff drawn quietly to the edges, and the lawyers arranged like pieces on a board. The demolition equipment waited just beyond the doors, and above it all the old departure signs still glowed faintly, as if the terminal itself had woken to testify. Conrad believed to the end that his daughter would choose the dynasty. Pierce believed she would choose the deal. Both men had made the same mistake, the very error that had followed this story from its first minute. They had underestimated her, exactly as they had underestimated the man in the worn jacket, and neither of them yet understood what that error was about to cost. Evelyn stepped forward and stood before locker 314. She did not begin with an accusation. She began with a confession, and that was what made the room fall silent. For many years she had run this company on the fear of being abandoned, and she had only recently learned that the fear itself had been built on a lie handed to her when she was too young to question it. The most powerful woman in the room had chosen to start by admitting she had been deceived. Then, one by one, she laid out the evidence for all of them to weigh. Her mother, Lillian Vale, had never abandoned the family at Gate B12. Locker 314 had held, for more than 20 years, the hidden records of the Vale Aviation Trust. Conrad Harrington Cross had concealed Lillian's ownership in order to control the airport assets. The agreement with Blackwell contained a clause designed to make Evelyn surrender her right to challenge the past. And Pierce Blackwell had known the legal danger and had pressed her to sign regardless. Conrad tried to break the spell, calling his daughter emotional, unfit, undone by sentiment. Pierce told the room she was destroying a shining future over a slip of paper from an airport worker. And that was the moment Evelyn had been waiting for. She turned toward the doors and invited Miles Callahan back into the room. He walked in, and he was not the same figure the guards had dragged backward that morning. He came as the witness who had preserved the airport's chain of evidence, and he spoke plainly and without drama. He explained how the locker had been discovered during the demolition survey, how its sealing record had been falsified more than 20 years before, and how the archived footage from Gate B12 proved that the story told for 2 decades did not match a single frame of what had actually happened. The satisfaction of the whole story lived in that reversal. The man they had judged unworthy of standing near the private gate now held the entire board in silence, each person leaning to catch every line of evidence from the mouth of someone they had been so certain was beneath them. The billionaire had his lawyers, the dynasty had its board and its jet, and all of it went quiet before a night shift worker who had simply kept the right proof, at the right moment, for the right reason. Evelyn declared that the merger with Blackwell was suspended, that Conrad was removed from every position of authority within the company, and that an independent audit would examine the whole of the family's airport holdings. There would be no quiet erasure, no clean signature, no burial of the past. There would be daylight, and there would be a full and public accounting. She set the note on the table before them all, the old paper soft at its folds, and she spoke the words that closed the meeting. "A stranger," she said, "handed me the truth that my own family stole from me. Today, of all the choices I have ever been given, I choose to believe the truth." Then she stepped back, and for the first time in her adult life, she felt no fear at all. In the months that followed, Harrington Cross Global entered a long and difficult restructuring. The merger with Blackwell collapsed. Pierce lost his path to the airport assets he had circled for so long, and his careful architecture of debt and clauses came apart in the light of the audit. Conrad, stripped of his honorary titles and placed under internal investigation, discovered at last that a reputation built on a single lie cannot survive the day the lie is finally opened. Evelyn found Lillian Vale. Her mother was not living in wealth, and she did not return like a flawless figure stepping back into a happy ending. She was a woman who had been forced into silence for far too long, who had learned to live with the particular grief of being misunderstood by her own daughter. Their reunion was not loud and was not drenched in easy tears. It was quiet, and it ached, two women sitting together in an airport waiting area, in the very kind of place where every journey in this story had once begun with a lie. Lillian did not ask Evelyn to forgive the past all at once. She only pressed a small sparrow pin into her daughter's pom-pom, the same emblem from the letters and the locker, and told her that she had never once stopped missing her. Some wounds are too old to heal in a single afternoon, but the pin closed a distance that 20 years of deception had held open, and that was enough for a beginning. They did not try to recover the years that had been taken. Those years were gone, folded into a settlement and a locked door, and a story told to a frightened child. Instead, they began, slowly, to build something new on the far side of the lie, a mother learning the woman her daughter had become, a daughter learning the mother she had been taught to hate. It was smaller than a fairy tale and far more real, and Evelyn found that she preferred it that way, because it was hers, and no one had handed it to her already broken. Miles was restored to his work and, in time, invited to help build an independent records division at the airport, dedicated to protecting lost belongings that carried legal or personal weight. He did not become a billionaire. He did not turn into a polished hero for the cameras. He remained a plain and steady single father who worked nights and made breakfast in the mornings. But the honor that had been taken from him was given back, and his daughter grew up knowing exactly what kind of man her father was. Evelyn came to see him one evening in the lost baggage area, a place that stood in perfect opposition to the glass boardrooms and the private jets, filled with worn suitcases, faded name tags, and objects no one had ever returned to claim. She told him that all her life she had believed the things left behind were the things without value. And yet, she said, it was exactly one forgotten object that had given her back her mother, her own history, and the right to decide the course of her life. Miles answered that an airport was not only a place where people left one another. Sometimes, he said, it was the place where lost things finally found their way home. She looked around at the shelves of the unclaimed and understood that he had spent his whole quiet career believing that, long before she had needed to hear it. The last scene belonged to Terminal B, Reborn. The wing was not destroyed after all. In the corner of the renovated space, the airport kept a small display about its own history, and at its center stood Locker 314. Behind the glass lay a copy of the note, the little silver sparrow, and a single line of text for every traveler who passed to read. The truth can be lost, it said, but that does not mean it has died. Evelyn stood there on the opening day and watched an aircraft climb into the sky beyond the runway, its engines fading into the clouds. For the first time in her life, the airport was not the place where her mother had abandoned her. It had become, instead, the place where an ordinary single father once pressed a small slip of paper into her hand, and that small slip of paper had given her back her entire life.